Hi, my name's Nadia, and welcome to my channel where I'm exploring some of the hidden history behind World War II. Today, I'm going to look at how Joseph Stalin, who's pictured here on the right, the leader of the Soviet Union, managed to take control of all of Poland at the end of the war. In many ways, it's a fascinating story because it was the invasion of Poland by Hitler, the leader of Germany pictured on the left, that was the trigger for the declaration of World War II. So logically, you would think that by the end of the war, when the Allies had defeated Hitler, that Poland would also have been liberated. But in fact, that's not what happened at all. So how did Stalin come to take control of Poland? Well, he did that through a series of steps that I've called decapitation at different levels of the Polish administration. So let's take a look at exactly what he did. Now, there's a popular misconception that the Polish army was quickly overrun by superior German forces invading from the west, and that this caused the collapse of Poland in September 1939. But in fact, that isn't what happened at all. The event that caused the collapse of Poland was in fact the invasion from the east, from the Soviet Union, on the 17th of September. Now, faced with enemy forces invading the country from both the west and the east, the Polish army had no chance of being able to defend the country. And so the government issued orders for the army to evacuate across the southern borders with Hungary and Romania, which were friendly countries. And once they had evacuated, the plan was that they would regroup with their allied countries. So this was Britain and France. And there they would regroup their army and launch a counter-offensive with their allies at a future date and liberate their country from enemy occupation. So this was not really a defeat, it was a setback, if you like, but the Polish fighting spirit was very much still alive and kicking. Now, there were hundreds of thousands of Polish troops who on that day were located in eastern Poland. And in fact, my father had been fighting in the defense of this historic city in the southeast, Lviv. And so he was extremely fortunate to happen to be relatively close to the Hungarian border. And he and other men from his battalion were able to successfully fight away against Soviet troops at the Hungarian border and escape to safety. But there were many other Polish troops who were in more distant locations of eastern Poland who simply couldn't reach the borders in time. And these Polish soldiers were taken prisoner by the Soviets. They were arrested, and most of them were deported to hard labor camps in Siberia. Now, among these hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers who were arrested by the Soviets, 22,000 were officers, and these were selected for special prison camps that were operated by the Soviet Secret Police, or NKVD. You can see the location of these NKVD prisons and the number of prisoners that were sent there in this map on the left. Their being sent to these special prison camps was in preparation for Stalin's first step in the decapitation of Poland, which was the decapitation of its military elite. In the spring of 1940, Stalin signed an execution warrant so that these people were murdered in cold blood with a bullet to the back of their head, either in the prisons where they were detained or in forests where their bodies were dumped in mass graves, like the one you can see in the photograph above me. Now, this was an act of genocide because it destroyed Poland's ability to mount a military insurrection against its hostile takeover. Now, the murder of the Polish army officers, which came to be known as the Katyn massacre, was followed starting around the same date by what I call the second step in his decapitation of Poland. And this was targeted at the civilian population living in East Poland here. There were 4 waves of deportations in which a total of 1.7 million Poles were deported to labor camps in Siberia. So this territory of Siberia was in the north and the east of the Soviet Union here. And some of these civilians were also deported to Kazakhstan, also part of the Soviet Union. Among the people that were deported were the wives and families of the Polish army officers who had been murdered at Katyn, but also the families of the officers who had managed to escape from Poland. So this included my father's family because he was an officer. My 68-year-old grandmother and 3 uncles were all deported to hard labor camps in Siberia, specifically because of their relationship to my father. Other people who Stalin had deported were policemen, the intelligentsia, and previous war veterans. Basically, this was anybody who might have the potential in the future to rally people around and mount an insurrection against Soviet rule. So the upshot of these deportations was that the population that was left behind had been completely subjugated and was living in terror of a constant fear of being arrested and deported. So people were cowed into submission and didn't dare to speak out against the authorities. But Stalin's plans to annex eastern Poland were nearly scuppered in the middle of 1941 when Hitler launched a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. So around 4 million German troops crossed into eastern Poland, which had been occupied by the Soviets. They pushed them out and then encroached further into the Soviet Union itself and laid siege to 3 major cities, Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. Stalin was caught completely off guard by this invasion by Hitler, and so his major cities were now under great threat, and he had lost his territory in Poland. However, by the winter of 1941, the German offensive ground to a halt because of the winter conditions. And in December, Stalin was able to launch a successful counteroffensive that drove the German troops to retreat. Now, the reason for mentioning Operation Barbarossa is that it was a turning point in the war, and it created a military alliance which was somewhat unlikely between Stalin, a ruthless dictator, and the West's most powerful leaders, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Now, the reason that these rather unlikely bedfellows came together at that time was because they were united in a common purpose, and that was the defeat of Hitler. But this alliance created an impossible predicament for Poland. Its exiled government and military were based in Britain and were being supported by their British ally. But there was now a problem because Britain also had an ally in Stalin, who was their mortal enemy. And the person at the sharp end of that predicament was this man, the Polish Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski. Now, Sikorski was a vocal and fierce opponent of Stalin, and he had riled his opponent previously by calling for an independent investigation into who was responsible for the Katyn massacre. He absolutely rejected Stalin's claims on East Poland. And he was also putting pressure on Stalin through negotiations with Churchill and Roosevelt to secure the release of all of the Polish prisoners detained in forced labour camps in Siberia. So, in short, he was quite an irritation to Stalin, and he might have exposed Stalin's genocide and ruined his plans to regain control of Poland. In 1943, Sikorski was killed in a mysterious aeroplane crash. It was a devastating blow to Poland because there was nobody else of Sikorski's international stature to replace him. And while nobody knows for sure exactly how this crash happened, I've called it step 3 in Stalin's decapitation of Poland, because I believe it has all the hallmarks of an assassination that was ordered by Stalin, and it was a prerequisite for what he did next. Events in 1944 moved very quickly with the arrival in northern France of the Western Allied military. So these were troops led by the British and Americans, and they included Polish troops that had managed to evacuate from Poland in 1939. My father was one of those. So these troops opened up a Western front against the German army, and at the same time, the German army was also being pushed back from the east by the Soviet forces. Now, while his Western allies were preoccupied with events going on in France, Stalin enacted a couple of further steps to ensure the political decapitation of Poland. He released some of his Polish prisoners from the Gulag to form a Polish army unit which fought alongside Soviet troops that entered into Poland to liberate it from Nazi occupation. So this gave an external validation to his Soviet forces as being liberators, when in actual fact his Polish unit was just being used to legitimize his takeover of Poland. The second thing that he did was, in the middle of Poland, in a city called Lublin, he installed the Polish Committee of National Liberation. Now, the people on this committee were Polish, but they were considered traitors because they were loyal to Stalin and they did his bidding. They authorized the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, to conduct security operations across Poland, which were intended to root out any remaining freedom fighters, and around 60,000 insurgents were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia. So this Committee of National Liberation, because it was composed of Poles, it gave the appearance to the outside world that it was a legitimate representative of the Polish population. but in fact it was simply a puppet government that had been installed by Stalin. And once it was recognised by Roosevelt and Churchill, the truly patriotic government of Poland that was in exile in London became obsolete. The final step in Stalin's decapitation of Poland is what I've called decapitation by treaty. And this was a territorial settlement that was agreed by the Big Three in Yalta in February 1945. At this meeting, Stalin proposed that Poland should receive war reparations in the form of a belt of territory in the west of Poland that would be annexed from Germany, who had invaded Poland in 1939. Now, a much more contentious proposal that Stalin made was that the Soviet Union should also receive war reparations in the form of this belt of land in the east of Poland. And if you think about it, that suggestion isn't logical at all, because by Stalin's reasoning, if anything, because Poland had been invaded in 1939 by both Germany and the Soviet Union, so Poland should then have received reparations in the form of territory from the Soviet Union, not the other way around. But rather remarkably, Roosevelt and Churchill both agreed to Stalin's proposals. This was seen as an incredible betrayal by the Polish army, who were serving alongside British and American troops in Europe at that time. And you can imagine that some of these troops were so devastated to be sold out by their own allies. Some of these soldiers committed suicide. A condition of the Yalta Agreement was that the provisional government of Poland, which was Stalin's puppet government, must hold democratic elections as soon as possible. Well, of course, in the event, they held elections, but they certainly weren't democratic. They were rigged, and they installed a landslide victory for the communist government that remained loyal to Stalin. The post-war settlements that were agreed at Yalta created friction between the West and the Soviet Union for decades to follow during the Cold War. And you can see from this map that Stalin gained substantial new territories as a result of the Second World War. And many of these countries in Eastern Europe lived under the yoke of Soviet repression for decades until the Union collapsed in 1991. While we're still living with the reverberations of these territorial disputes today, the current president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, sees the collapse of the Soviet Union as a national tragedy. And his unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2022 threatens to pitch the West into a third world war. Not surprisingly, Poland is one of Ukraine's staunchest allies against Putin. Well, I hope you've learned something new from watching my video. If you did, please give me a like below and check out some of my other videos.